welcome to the Messiantics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Shalom, guys, and thanks for joining us today. We have an interesting conversation we're going to dive into, and our hope is that this will be just a conversation. We're not shooting for this to be like any one of the four of us jumping up on a soapbox and preaching at you or anything along those lines, but there are a few things that are kind of floating around in conversation among the four of us that we thought could be very beneficial to the movement as a whole and the body as a whole, so we just wanted to hit record and kind of let the conversation flow. But that idea is on the topic of congregational development and growth and what that should look like, what that really means, and how to set ourselves up as congregations and ultimately as the Messianic Jewish movement as a whole for a sustainable future where we're actually impacting the world for the kingdom of Messiah and what that looks like. So we're just going to kind of dive into the discussion and just see where it goes.
Yeah, I have gone to, I cannot tell you how many different conferences where they did sessions or entire conferences on congregational development. The problem is that much of them either focused on, they brought in somebody who had 30,000 members in their congregation, a team of 125 pastors, a sermon writing committee that met a year in advance to write. So it was totally unrelatable to anybody in the room. The other one was that was spent all its time on dealing with what we would call evangelism or outreach, but very little time on actually building a foundation within the community, the congregation, so that when somebody came to the congregation, there would be a foundation for them to stand on, and how to establish a healthy leadership team, core team, because the truth is, statistically, it doesn't matter what congregation you're from, 10% of the people do 90% of the work. So how do we choose that 10%? How do we commission them to do things? How do we establish what to do to grow? And then how do we compensate and help them to be able to achieve? Because it's amazing. I have friends who are teachers that are some are in public schools, some are in private schools, Christian schools and such, religious schools. And it's amazing how the religious schools all pay their teachers less than the public schools, and they justify it by saying it's a ministry, as if somebody in ministry should starve to death because that is their calling. And we apply that, unfortunately, across our community, not only to our clergy, because the majority of clergy, the majority of people that lead congregations are bivocational or trivocational. We have many of our congregational leaders who work jobs outside of their congregation, and many of them work more than one job outside their congregation. I did that for many years. I led the congregation and then had 1, 2, sometimes 3 different jobs that I did in order to be able to afford to pay bills so I could live. And many, I see these memes all the time about these, the pastors having these huge houses and fancy cars and all, when the reality is that 80% of congregations in the United States have less than 100 people in them, and more than 70% have less than 60. So, and most congregational leaders actually give more to their congregations than they get by the time it's all statistically washed out through there. And that's a shame, and it's also something that shouldn't happen. And it's something we want to talk about, not just the finances, but the reality of, if we're going to have good people doing good work within our community, then they should be, a workman is worthy of his hire. There should be sustenance for them within the community and what they're doing.
And I just want to say, to preface the discussion, this isn't, all four of us are rabbis. All four of us are in pastoral ministry. And this isn't all four of us sitting here on a soapbox saying we don't get enough, or we're not holding our hand out. That's not what we're saying. But all the things that Rabbi Eric mentioned about what, all these circumstances about how much leaders give and this, that, and the other. If there's not things put in place to support leadership, it leads to burnout, and it leads to them just getting crushed into dust.
Yeah.
And starving your rabbi or your pastor is not building their faith.
Right. And that's all. I just want to say that this isn't just like, this is a serious thing, because ministry in itself, even in a healthy ministry, burnout is just at times inevitable.
Yeah. And I want to preface coming off of this with the fact that, I'm not complaining about my pay.
No.
And no, I mean, I just want to make sure that the people aren't, like you're saying, we're not retelling. The Lord has blessed us at our congregation. We have a thriving congregation, and we're unusual because we have not only a full-time rabbi and a full-time assistant rabbi, although both of us do some kind of side gig work to supplement. And largely I do what I do because I give that money away. It's not money that I use for to pay my household bills. We've lived to a way where we can do that. Yeah. But we also have 5 full-time congregational administration staff. Mm-hmm. We pay our worship leader a stipend for doing what she does. We have a yard outside maintenance person that we pay a salary to, or not a salary because he actually works for himself, but it's a stipend, a pay that we pay him. So I'm not, when we have this discussion, I don't want anybody to think we're saying this because we're trying to get our congregations to pay us more, or we want you to send us money because woe is me. Yeah. Although I also want to make it very clear that if anybody listening wants to send money, we don't want them to feel like that's not the Lord speaking to their heart.
I think this is more what this is going to be is a conversation about, if you're in a congregation or know of a congregation where they're not taking care of their leader, then that should change.
Or if if the care is lopsided and you have all these lay leaders that are killing themselves.
Yeah.
Essentially doing a full-time job while they're working another full-time job, and you have leadership that isn't worrying about a dang thing, you got a problem too.
Yeah. And here's the reality about it. And part of what kind of spawned this conversation was before we sat down to record this episode, Rabbi Jonathan and I were talking about this very reality, how the Messianic Jewish movement, our rabbis are getting older, if we're honest about it, and quite a few of our rabbis are in a position where they really need to have an understudy, an assistant or associate rabbi that they can build up and prepare to, not tomorrow, but at some point in the future, to transition leadership over to. But the reality is that most of our congregations in the Messianic Jewish movement have always operated off of the day-to-day, what comes in immediately goes out mindset. There's a salary sometimes for the senior leader, but that's maybe about it. And they're saving money for this or that or the other, or they're spending on this and that and so on. But there's nothing set up for that. But younger leaders, like especially as the Messianic Jewish movement has developed, when I first became a rabbi in the movement, the reality was that guys that went to school for this before entering into ministry was few and far between. Mm-hmm. Right? I was not the only, but one of the early ones that this is what I went to school for. I trained for this for a number of years before going into rabbinic leadership and so on. Most of our rabbis were either pastors in a church when God called them out into Messianic Judaism, or they were in some sort of other career field, and then God called them into planting a Messianic congregation or what have you. And so there really wasn't a necessity for most of the last 40 plus years for congregations to develop salaries and such for the future. But now we've got guys that this is what we've gone to school for. This is what we are being trained for, and where our heart and our calling is. And the honesty about it is, and nobody really wants to have this conversation, but the honesty about it is that a rabbi or a pastor is full-time in ministry no matter what. Doesn't matter what they do outside the congregation. Yeah. Pastoral ministry is a full-time job. right? You're always going to get the late night phone calls that somebody's in the hospital. You're always going to have the last minute funerals, the unexpected deaths that you have to go and sit with the family. You're always going to have weddings and premarital counseling. You're always going to have bar mitzvah trainings and all of these things are always going to be there. Should be spending ample time on prepping a message every week and research and study and prayer and so on. It is a full-time gig no matter what, right? And so if the rabbi then also has to, it's one thing if, like in the early days of our congregation, the first 6 years of our congregation, I worked outside the synagogue, I worked in restaurants, but that was a choice that we made because we knew this was what God called us to do to start this congregation. We knew that we weren't going to be able to get a paycheck or anything for a while, so we needed to be able to support our family, so I went to work and went back into the workforce, and that's what I did full-time outside of the synagogue. But the reality is that if you have a congregational leader who is working outside the synagogue, they're full-time in ministry either way it goes. But when they have to get a job out, if they want to, that's a different discussion. But if they have to get a job outside of the congregation to support their family, it's not the congregation that's going to lose out. It's not the ministry that's going to make sacrifice of their time. It's that rabbi's family. Their family's going to lose out because you're full-time in ministry whether you like it or not. Those phone calls at night about hospital visits, they're going to keep coming in, and there's nothing you can do about that. They're going to be there. The prep work for a message for the weekend is going to be there. The prep work for Bible studies and so on is all going to be there. That's not going away. But when you have to work outside the congregation because the congregation isn't able to or hasn't planned for paying for it, your family's the one losing out. They're going to miss the extra 30, 40, 50 hours a week that you're spending in a second job somewhere outside the congregation. And we've got to, as a movement, as a congregation, as rabbinic organizations, we have to do a better job of planning and prepping for an actual future, because new rabbis coming in, what we're yearning for, longing for, are young leaders. Young leaders coming in means young families. Young families don't need their father, their paternal figure, the husband in that family, to have to put 40, 50, 60 plus hours a week into the congregation and another 40, 50, 60 plus hours a week into a secular job to provide for their family. That it's just an unrealistic expectation. Now, if that rabbi wants to, like for me, one of the things I want to get to is to a place where we have a dependable passive income coming in outside the congregation. My wife jokes about it all the time, but one of my goals, and I know it's a weird thing, but one of my goals is to establish several laundromats where, it's self-serve laundromats, but the funds are coming in. You come in a couple of times a week to make sure things are clean, neat, everything's operating properly, collect stuff, make deposits, whatever. But it's a minimal input of time and labor, and big expense up front, but a minimal input of time and labor on a regular basis, but a steady stream of income. Mm-hmm. I also like the idea of self-serve car washes too, but that's a whole other story. But doing something like that, that's great, that's fine, that's wonderful, and that helps set you up for a better future. But the expectation that the rabbi should, as a matter of fact, the reason why I went down this trail of thought was because Rabbi Jonathan said, we were having this conversation, he goes, obviously there's this expectation of the rabbi having to make sacrifice to do that, and that's true 100%. Yeah. Honestly, the sacrifice is in those late night phone calls about hospital runs, or in those last minute funerals that are unexpected, or those are where the sacrifice is, honestly, and it's a sacrifice of avodah. It's an actual service, offering before the Lord. It's a worship before the Lord, but that's where the sacrifice is, and it's fine and wonderful to expect that kind of a sacrifice of the pastoral figure, the shepherd figure of the congregation, but to expect that rabbi or pastor's family to make the sacrifice for him to do ministry is a whole separate problem. Yeah,
and I think that's probably what I wasn't. Earlier when we were talking, I wasn't really taking that into consideration, because Catherine and I will have just been married 2 years this April, so I'm even still learning to this is going to affect my time with Catherine and Eli, and this is just I was tent making last night. I clean playgrounds and local restaurants at night, because that's the only time you can clean them, is when the restaurant's closed. So I'll go and I'll clean, and it's 9 o'clock takes about 4 hours sometimes. So I'll show up at 8:45, 9 o'clock. I'll clean from 9 to 1, 2 o'clock sometimes if it's really bad. I've climbed through those tunnels before and just wiped up trails of kid stuff. Yeah. Right. So just it's there's it's work, and it's laborious, and I don't get home till 2 or 3. And by the time I actually get all my tools put away and showered off, I'm getting into bed at 3 or 4 in the morning, then getting up to get back to the office. So, it's just one of those things where I'm like, this is, and my wife has told me, like, basically in the nicest, shortest way possible, this has a time limit.
Yeah.
Because it does affect my ability to be there with her, with Eli.
And I think that goes into Paul in Timothy and Titus saying that a elder, a pastor, a shepherd, however you want to look at that, has to be able they have to have a good orderly household, right? That's not to say like their kids have to be robotic and do what they're told. I mean, kids are going to be kids.
Get their chores done perfectly.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that they rule their household by an iron fist and whatever. But what it does mean is they have to actually be a part of their family.
They have to have a functional home.
And there are some things and aspects to this discussion that I think differently than many others, because before we hired a assistant rabbi, we hired administrative staff because I knew that there were things that needed to be taken care of administratively in order to build up a foundation. There's a lot of pastors and rabbis that try to do everything all on their own, or they don't try to, it's almost they have to. And there's this thought that when you hire a rabbi, you get his wife as a and sometimes it is that way that they're a team. But if I got a job at a bank as a bank vice president or a branch manager or something, the bank would not assume that my wife was going to come in and be the receptionist and teller
for free.
They wouldn't think that just because they hired me that they get my wife as a an unpaid co-partner in my efforts. Yeah. And yet that is largely what happens in ministry is you hire the rabbi or the pastor, and then the wife is now the administrator, the Sunday school teacher, the choir director, the nursery worker, all those things. Yeah. And that shouldn't be that way. So we looked at our community, and I realized there were things, for instance, we had people that came regularly that just disappeared. And I didn't even know they had left until, because there's a lot of times when good people come to your congregation and they're there all the time and they're not problematic, so they don't hit your radar. A lot of times the people that hit our radar the most are the ones that cause the most problems. And so we end up spending a lot of our time ministering to the needs of the problems, and then we don't connect with the people that are just there, that are quiet, that give, that come, that serve, that do, but they're just not noisemakers. Yeah. And we had some of those people that had left for different reasons, and all of a sudden I realized they were gone. And had we had a better administrative setup, that wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have lost them through the cracks. Things wouldn't have gone on that I didn't notice because I was busy trying to put out fires. Wasn't there. So we hired a full-time administrator, and then we hired a part-time, and then we made them full-time, and then we had another one we hired full-time, and we had 4 full-time administrative staff before we hired our assistant rabbi. But having that staff in place allowed us to have the pillars in place to hold up all the people that were coming so that we would then have the resources to hire an assistant rabbi. And when we hired our first administrator, we had no idea how we were going to pay her. Yeah. We just knew we had to, that it wasn't an option if things were going to get done. And we were going to grow, we were going to have to figure out how to do this, and we just trusted the Lord. Now, it turned out that the money to pay her for several months was in my office already in checks that we hadn't deposited to the bank because my administrative skills and my filing system was new on top, old on bottom. And my wife would come in to rearrange my office to straighten things up, and things got moved. And when we hired the administrator, she went through my office and filed everything and organized it. We bought file cabinets and folders and all that kind of stuff. And she found enough checks that we deposited to cover her salary for several months that were already in the office that God provided in advance to kind of give me a little wink that we were doing the right thing. But knowing that these things, having paid administrative staff, having a stipend that you give to your worship leader, that showing people that their work is not less valuable because they don't have a title in front of their name of rabbi or pastor is vital to the health of a congregation, in my opinion.
And this is a multi-layered, multi-leveled problem, because it's not just the rabbis and senior leadership that we have to think about in this regard. It's the lay leadership. It's the worship leaders and youth leaders. I've been an assistant rabbi by God's grace. Since July, I've been actively serving. Really since September, but I've been in the position since July of last year. So, 7 months.
Yeah, it's been that long already.
Right. So most of my time, and I'm thankful for everybody should be thankful for the path that God took them through. Everybody's different. But my wife and I, and we are one of those married teams, and we've done nearly everything together. Worship leadership and youth leadership is something we've done in tandem for years. Like we were both. We were the youth leaders and we were the worship leaders. And we were bivocational the entire time.
Yeah.
Now, I've said this a lot. 16 years in public education. 14 and a half as a classroom teacher. And that job by itself will grind you to dust.
Yeah. Well, it's almost a ministry by itself.
And for senior leaders who don't have the issue of worrying about their salary and having much more, exponential more time to devote to their calling, it's so important not to burn out your lay leadership, your worship leaders, your youth leaders. Here's the thing. If you can't, and every congregation's different, but everybody, and like Rabbi David said earlier, this is a conversation that needs to happen, and really we're not coming up with solutions as much as we're really kind of raising the issue and raising the question. But here's the thing. Everybody should stop, all the congregations, senior leadership, stop and look at your budget and look at those things. And can you pay your worship leader a stipend or a salary? Can you pay your youth leader a stipend or a salary?
Yeah.
But here's the thing. You've got to look at what they're doing day in and day out, because if you don't have the resources to put them on part-time or full-time, you don't get to text them things like, where are you? It's 6 o'clock. You don't get to come up to, it's 6 o'clock, like after a work day, and say, hey, you're supposed to be here. You don't get to come up to them and say, hey, we need you every night at the Sukkot celebration to lead worship. You don't get to say things like that.
Yeah.
You don't get to do that because and you don't get to say this either. Well, here's the thing. If I pay you a salary, we're going to have to pull from our missions. Oh, but here's the thing. If you undermined your bedrock foundation at your home congregation and your leadership is grinded down to dust and you're essentially making bread out of their bones, you will not be able to effectively. You're going to kill your congregation from the inside, and you can forget your mission.
But you can't grow people.
Your outreach.
You won't be able to grow anybody. Decide you won't.
And I've been there, and I've been in suits making, trying to make my last meal before the Yom Kippur fast.
Yeah.
I'm like hurrying up, and I'm getting texts. Hey, you're supposed to. Where are you at? The worship team needs to practice, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Everybody. It requires from senior leaders preparing for the future.
Yeah.
To senior leaders that are taking care of, thinking about their lay leadership. Everybody's got to look in the mirror.
Yep.
But the one thing is always this: hey, we have missions. We have kids that can't eat, and we have kids that can't eat in these countries, and this, that, and the other. I understand.
Yeah.
But if you deteriorate the bedrock of your ministry, which is your home congregation and the people that are coming, and not thinking about even your internet outreach.
Yeah.
Thinking about your home congregation, if you start degrading that, everything else will fall apart.
There's a biblical precept, and something one of my elders constantly reminds me is that serving starts at the household of faith. In other words, it starts at your congregation. Years ago, I went through EMT training and was a firefighter.
Yeah.
And did all that. And the first thing they teach you in EMT training is the scene safe? When you arrive at an accident, before you rush out to go help somebody, you make sure that you're not going to get injured and endanger yourself. You stand, if there's power lines on the ground waving all over the place, you don't go try to help somebody, because 2 dead people isn't better than 1 dead person.
Right.
And it's wonderful when you can give to other ministries and other congregations and other things. But if you're withering on the vine trying to do that, then you're not accomplishing. And you would be able to give more if you got your people healthy and blessed to those other congregations. So it's vital, as you said, to physically, to emotionally, to spiritually abuse people as if they were slaves to your congregation. While giving money to outside ministries. It's just as frustrating to me. Listen, I support giving to Israel. Our congregation gives to Israel. I love people who minister in Israel. But half of the Jews in the world almost are still in the United States.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful that people in the United States want to support ministries in Israel, and we should, but not at the expense of not ministering to Jews in the United States at the same time. We can do both if we do it right and we're healthy doing it. Same thing in our congregations. We have to be giving and blessing and serving the people in our communities so that they're healthy, so that they can. And again, that's why we went administrative heavy because our administrators are the ones who they call people and say, you weren't here on Shabbat. Can we pray for you? Are you doing okay? They're the ones that are sending groceries to families that need it, or sending meals to mothers that just had babies, or people that got out. Things that I wouldn't have the time to do that need to be done. But they're saying, when the apostles got together, they said it's not good for us to take care of the physical needs of the people, but that doesn't mean they don't need to get done. That means that we have to find people that can do that and bless and help them to do that so that both get accomplished.
Yeah, and that's it. So much of it is lack of planning or forethought, which is crazy to me because, Yeshua explicitly, gave an example of, you don't sit down and count the cost before you start building a project. Then the world looks at you and laughs at you and mocks, and who is this who started building and then couldn't finish it because he didn't prepare, or figured out he couldn't afford it. And because and I've heard senior leadership say that before in other places, like we're not going to plan, just going to be let God take it. And it's like, God calls you to plan,
and I think that's a. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it was you have to actually take the steps. Faith requires you to actually step out and do the thing.
I think that's a byproduct of years of being insulated.
Yeah. By
elders and boards,
and we have this false impression that piety or humility equals poverty.
Right. Yeah.
That in order to be pious, in order to be holy, in order that we have to be in poverty. But when we looked at Yeshua, he had the most expensive, and I'm not saying we all should have the most expensive clothes, but he did not have cheap clothes.
Yeah.
And although it says he didn't have a place to lay his head, that meant he didn't have his own home. Mm-hmm. That didn't mean that he didn't have somewhere to sleep. And when they came to him and said, we have thousands of people here to feed, it wasn't that they didn't have any money. They just didn't have food for 20,000. Right.
Yeah.
That's different. I mean, Judas was stealing money from the bank. It wasn't that they were broke and they were in poverty and they were doing without. It was, and we need to change our mindset. Ministry should not be overwhelming luxury to the point where our people are suffering, but we're living in splendor.
$300 shoes.
Right. It also should not be that we're living in squalor while our congregants are there's a balance, a real balance. And if we want to have healthy congregations, we not only have to have our leaders, our senior leaders, the rabbis and pastors, making enough money to be able to pay their bills and provide for their family. We also have to have our sub-leaders or our lay leaders, or those that are working with us, making enough so that they can reasonably pay their bills. Again, to the expectation, and the congregation needs to understand that. It's interesting. My wife and I tell this story, for 28 years we never went on vacation because we just didn't, we were so caught up in this mindset that I have to be at my congregation, that things will fall apart if I'm not there. There's an expectation I'll be there, and the only way that they're going to pay me is if I'm in that bema all the time, and I don't make enough now, and the only way I'm going to make more is if I'm there all the time and doing. So we didn't take vacation, and one day I woke up and I went, normal people that have been in ministry in a job for as long as I've been here get 2 or 3 or 4 weeks vacation a year, and I've never taken one. So we took a vacation, and I know this might shock everybody, but the congregation didn't fold. They had a service without me there. Everything went on, and it's just, we have to understand that we have to take care of ourselves, and that there's a biblical expectation that the oxen won't be muzzled. That they'll be able to work and do what they have to do, that they'll be loved by their community, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you is not just a precept for others, but it also applies to how we treat our leaders, and not just our congregation. And again, please understand, I am so blessed. My wife and I have a nice house. We drive a nice car. We're not rich, but we're not poor. We're not complaining about what we're doing. But I see so many in our movement that struggle and that aren't, and that we are muzzling the ox, and we're keeping our congregations small and anemic because we're not loving our leaders and giving them the sustenance that they need to be able to be.
And this isn't just, like, again, our congregations take very good care of us, among the 4 of us here. Really, what we're speaking to is kind of goes back to what we talked about several months ago. What is going to build a strong future for Messianic Judaism? And when you have young men, especially, who stepping into, who feel a calling from God to step into rabbinic ministry or some other kind of service to the Messianic world, you have who are walking with God already. And if they have families, that means they're taking care of their families. And so if they have a good career, a good job, that they're supporting their families are comfortable, their families are fed, their families are safe. And again, like I was talking about earlier, to a degree, there is an expectation that you will sacrifice some. But to expect your younger leaders to take a massive fall forward, because it's not just a step down. A lot of congregations, they're like, oh yeah, please, any of you seen those the old carriage steps? Like before cars, we had the horse-drawn carriages, the old houses, those carriage steps. They're about 2 feet high, and you step off that in the dark. It's not like missing one step. It's like you're falling on your face. Most congregations, a lot of them, they're just like, well, we'll find some young leaders, and we'll just kind of expect them to kind of step down real fall and maybe twist an ankle or two and not be able to take care of their family, or they'll just work themselves to death. And not be able to pour anything into the ministry, because by the time they get to Shabbat, because instead of resting on Shabbat like everyone else is resting on Shabbat, they're actually still performing the services that are performed on Shabbat, the avodah, which is good and should be expected. It's holy, but you cannot expect an ox to continue to plow and to tread and to thresh out grain 7 days a week, all the time,
because you run the risk of what we talked about at recently, which was earlier this month, which was these congregations that die with their senior leader because they didn't plan. And Rabbi David, I was amazed that there are boroughs in New York, boroughs in New York City with no Messianic congregation. It's intense.
Yeah, it's because you're not willing to. They're not willing to risk taking care of their family, which God tells you, take care of their family. You're worse than an infidel if you don't take care of your family. So they're not willing to trespass into that field of being someone that God is unhappy with. And so they won't. So it's not that there aren't young people willing to step in the position. It's that you're not willing to help them step into that position.
And honestly, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the case everywhere or anywhere, but I do know that there are quite a few congregations that exist, Messianic synagogues that exist in areas where they've been around for years and years and years. They still rent from churches or what have you, because the cost of property and ownership is just so insane where they're located. Because most Messianic synagogues are or a lot of Messianic synagogues are in metropolitan areas with large Jewish communities, and in metropolitan areas there's a very high cost of property ownership, and so there are a lot of Messianic congregations that have spent decades saving up money for building funds for the future, for being able to buy a building at some point, knowing in the here and now the likelihood of that happening is slim to none, unless some drastic miracle occurs, which is, and I'm not saying that can't occur, but if you've got say a couple $100,000 in a savings somewhere for a building fund, and your senior leader is 60, 70 years old, and you need to be planning for a future, it might not be a terrible sacrifice to say, okay, well, we're not going to be buying a building in the next 5-10 years because property values are only going up. If you've got $200,000 in the bank and everything in your area that you're looking at is $3, $4, $5, $6, $7 million or more, that little bit's not going to make a difference. Right. So it might be worthwhile to reallocate 50, 60,000 of that, or whatever your area requires cost of living wise, to reallocate those funds for a 1-year startup salary for a assistant or associate leader to come in and help and get ready for what the next part is. Because how do we know that the resources that are in that building fund isn't something God is setting up and planning for when the next step comes in? Because sometimes that senior leader can only take that congregation, that founding leader can only take that congregation so far. Yeah. And then it's time to hand it off to the person that God has, just like Moses and Joshua. Moses could only take Israel so far, and then he had to hand off leadership and the anointing to Joshua, who then took Israel to the next place that God had in store for him. And what's to say that building purchase doesn't come along at some point after that? And I'm not saying that's always going to be the case, but there are things that can be done. There are also resources available outside of your own individual congregation that can assist you in developing salaries. So, right. For instance, our congregation reached out to another large Messianic Jewish organization, and they have guaranteed a set a dollar value every month for X number of years to assist with Rabbi Toby's salary. And Brit Am also guaranteed a dollar value for X number of months. I think it was for 1 year to assist with the foundation of Rabbi Toby's salary as we brought him in. And so there are resources available. And to be honest, the reason I said it's something that organizationally we need to be more intentional on is because organizationally our rabbinic organizations could do far better. We really could.
We need to get out. My grandparents, who were amazing people, my mom's parents, lived through the end of the Holocaust. They lived through some really tough times here in the United States. They succeeded. They lived. They were successful people. They weren't, but they never bought napkins. Mm-hmm. They never bought salt and pepper. They never bought ketchup. Their stuff at their house was whatever restaurant that they went to. They brought the ketchup with them. They brought the salt and pepper. Because their mentality was still in the suffering and the poverty, and we can't afford to spend money on this. We're gonna, when I go to the restaurant, just grab some extra napkins, just grab some extra salt and pepper, some mayonnaise, some ketchup, stuff like that. The Messianic movement needs to get beyond that mentality that we can't buy or do because we're the little guys, we're the small, we're just the statistical anomaly. And realize that if we are a prophetic movement, if we are an end time revival movement, as we claim we are, that God is restoring what was, then we have to trust that He's going to restore all of it, and we need to get to the point where we're working together, where we're sharing, where we're helping one another, where barn raising becomes more of a reality, figuratively and spiritually, where we're not competing against each other. I love the relationship we have in our Gulf Coast area because when somebody comes to our synagogue that lives closer to Rabbi David's, we tell them, hey, do you know that there's a congregation in Daphne that's closer to you, or one in Navarre that's closer to you, or one in Dothan that's closer to you? Why don't you go visit there? Why don't you see if you can plant yourself closer to that? We're not building our kingdom. We're building his kingdom.
Right.
And our mentality is, how do we be a blessing? It wasn't even a hesitation of our leadership to say, can we send some money every month to help Rabbi David cover Toby's salary? Because in our view, if Rabbi David's congregation grows, our congregation has grown. If a revival takes place in Africa and 1,000 people come to faith, we just grew by 1,000 people in our congregation, because we're part of the same body. Yeah. We're not in competition with each other. We're working together to build a community. And when we get that mindset, we get out of the poverty mindset that we can't afford to do, that we can't afford to give, that we can't afford to spend money on that, or we can't afford to hire somebody or whatever. I have never hired somebody at our congregation that God hasn't provided the means to meet their needs and meet our goal, because first of all, we pray about it and we seek the Lord, and we don't just jump ahead. We're not climbing out on the branch and then cutting the branch off behind us. Yeah. We're praying about it, seeking the Lord, and doing. And because they're doing their job, they're planting a new field so we can harvest more in that field.
And with that, that notion of spending time in prayer before making decisions, like, we've got to get out of the mindset, and this feeds into that the poverty mentality you were talking about. We've got to get out of the mindset of focusing on what we think we can't do, and start focusing on what God can do if it's his leading. If it's his leading, what we think we can't do doesn't matter, because he's already paved the way. Look, our building that we own, and you guys had very similar situation with both buildings that you guys have owned. Our building that we own, when we started, trying to make moves on it, like, we approached the denomination that we bought it from. We approached them with a lease with option, with X number of dollars down and X number of dollars a month for that lease, with a certain percentage of that going towards the purchase price when we closed on it. We didn't have that down payment we were offering. Like, it wasn't there, but we truly felt like this was a God thing, and if it was a God thing, he was going to put it together. And so we made moves, and we started doing, trusting that he was, and I kid you not, they accepted the offer that evening, and within 2 weeks, we had that down payment available.
Yeah, we raised
just instantaneously.
Yeah. For our current building, when we were renting the building we're in now, we own another building that we were renting out to another congregation, but we had outgrown that building, so we moved to our current building. We were renting it, and the people that owned it said, look, we have an offer to buy the building. You guys have 60 days to exercise your right of refusal, or you're going to have to move. And so in 60 days, we raised more than $80,000 so that we could put the down payment down on our current building. But in the way that happened, we had initially made a deal to pay $1.4 million for our building, that when we signed our lease option. But when they pulled the exercise your option to buy, all we had to do was buy it for the amount of money the other people offered, which was $750,000. Wow. So we ended up buying our building for half of what we had committed to buy it for, and God raised the money for our down payment so that we could get into the building. In 60 days, we raised more than $80,000. And it wasn't, and we weren't like shaking people and poor-mouthing or any of that. We were just, look, if this is what God wants us to do, he's going to provide. He's going to provide it through you and for people like you. If you feel led, contribute. And we had people from all over the world that donated money and gave, and we did all kinds of things. But it was amazing how God provided to meet our needs. And he will, if we hear his voice and walk in the steps. The steps of a righteous man are ordered by God. If we do what he says, he will always be sufficient and faithful.
Yeah. So the final analysis essentially is we look at it from on the side of the senior leader or senior leadership. It's about we have to, older generation senior leaders need to obviously find ways to prepare their congregations for the future, it's also important for the congregations to understand that senior leadership needs to be taken care of and needs to be provided for, and not killing themselves to live life abundantly and to serve, and also the final analysis regarding senior leadership understanding lay leadership. And again, if the senior leader or the senior leadership may be taken care of, but again, if your worship and youth leaders are getting crushed because they're dealing with the same problems on a smaller scale. Yeah. Conflicts happen. Look, some of the worst conflicts I've experienced in ministry have been within worship. Oh gosh, really? Worship. Oh my Lord, the personalities.
And it's important to remember that because the senior leader, like we founded our congregation, we went through the struggles of starting the congregation and going through all that happened. But because I went through that struggle doesn't mean that Jonathan has to go through, that struggle. When the children of Israel went through the wilderness and got into the promised land, Joshua didn't tell the next generation, okay, you guys all go back to Egypt and walk it through again so that you can take the next step. Yeah. And we have, for some reason, we think because I struggled, then in order for Jonathan to have the same spiritual appreciation, he's got to suffer through my wilderness.
Yeah. The reality is, like, baby boomers growing up in the 80s and 90s, the thing that we heard all the time was go to college so you can have a better job and a better life than I had, from our parents, our grandparents. Go to college and everything else will follow me. The older generation that did the fight, that put in the struggle, the toil, everything to build what it is now, they should be desiring for handing off something that's better than what we created, because and from that they should be hoping that, just like the baby boomers hoping for their children, they should be hoping that they have an easier and better life moving forward. And I think that part of the problem is that we are still very much in the pioneer mindset of the Messianic movement is very much in a pioneer mindset, because those that are still kind of leading things in the primary, the mass number of leaders in the Messianic movement are still the pioneers that started this whole thing, and I think in a lot of ways there's a hesitation to move towards the future out of a fear that the next generation will simply destroy or demolish or whatever what has been built, rather than trusting that if this is in fact an end-time divinely orchestrated and ordained movement, then God has it all under control, and He has already prepared a new generation who will not only pick up where you've left off, but that will carry this into the next phase that God has in store.
The next generation, my hope is that Jonathan never goes through the struggles that I went through to get the congregation to where it is now.
Because I have plenty of my own.
Yeah, because he doesn't have to do that to see the value of what's taken place. I want him to inherit what we've built and see the value in that inheritance, regardless, without having to go through the stuff to get there.
One of the things I think would be super helpful to get your mentality, because really what needs to happen is that mentality change, attitude shift. And one of the ways to change that, especially if you're small, just starting out, maybe you don't have a whole lot to do, or maybe the giving has just been so focused on paying the rent, paying the lights, making sure there's those things. Find a way to care for your leader. Whether that's, you could, if someone could come in and be like, hey, I'll come in and I'll clean your house. Right. Or I had a neighbor the other week who knows I'm both in ministry and have a brand new baby. And he was like, hey, let me cut your lawn, and cut my front and back lawn. I was like, thank God, because it goes a long way. It felt great. It goes a super long way. We have people who here at the synagogue who they bring us half a gallon of milk, from fresh milk from their cows, every week. Right. And we used to have some people who gave eggs, which, now that's like, you're rolling in gold if you got eggs. So,
it's important to do those little things because it shows love. Yeah. It shows that. But the other thing I want to say in closing is that if you're a leader of a congregation or you're on a leadership team of a congregation and you're struggling be honest about it with your organization, with your people you're in relationship with,
your elders,
because many, not just your elders, but the organization. For instance, we're part of the IMCS. If we get into a place where we're struggling, if I reach out to leaders within the IMCS, God doesn't allow a circumstance to arise that He doesn't have a solution for.
Right.
And the Scripture says, "Heaped up, pressed down, shaken together, shall men give unto you." The help is there, but we have to be humble enough to say, "Hey,
I need help.
Our air conditioner broke, and we need some help, or this happened, or my wife had surgery, and I need some help," or whatever it is that's going on, because there are people in our community, in the Messianic community, that love us, that will reach out, but they can't read minds. And they don't know what's happening if we're not sincere and honest about it, and looking for opportunities to reach out and say, "Hey, I need some help." There's other times where I've called people up and said, "Hey, we were really blessed. Are you needing anything? Can we help you? How do we do this?" Because that's how this is supposed to work.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I hope this has been a blessing to you. If it was, I hope you'll share it with others. If you haven't already subscribed to our channels, do that. Anyhow, I think this has been a profitable discussion. I think it's been something that was at least helpful to get out. It was cathartic to say, even if and we're hopeful that people will listen to it, and not only listen to it, but they'll apply. And if you have ideas or thoughts on how to achieve these things, please email us, comment on YouTube or Facebook or wherever you're seeing this, and share with us so that we can share it with others. The answer to all these things is out there. We just need to know how to do it and how to apply it.
Thank you for listening to the Messiantics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at Messiantics Podcast.